The Galactic Council's flagship, Aurora Zenith, hovered in the void like a predator in wait, its sleek hull glinting with the faint luminescence of nearby starlight. Edward Sterling stepped from the human shuttle onto the alien craft's docking platform, his polished boots clicking against the metallic surface. He straightened his navy blue diplomatic uniform, its insignia of Earth's crest gleaming under the cold lights of the hangar. His stride was calm, deliberate, every movement measured. The air was laced with tension, an unspoken hostility that Edward felt keenly. The towering alien guards flanking the platform, with their iridescent scales and sharp, unblinking eyes, made no attempt to mask their disdain. He offered them a thin, polite smile, noting their rigid posture and the way their clawed hands twitched near their weapons. At the far end of the platform stood General Karath, a hulking figure with deep crimson skin and a crown of curved horns. He was flanked by a smaller alien with silver-gray features, who scribbled notes into a translucent data pad. Karath's lips curled into what might have been a smile, though it bore more teeth than warmth. "Ambassador Sterling," Karath said, his voice a low rumble that reverberated through the hangar. "It is enlightening to host a representative of humanity aboard our vessel." Edward inclined his head slightly, his icy blue eyes meeting Karath's with a piercing gaze that caused even the general to pause. "The honor is mine, General. I hope our discussions today will strengthen the bond between Earth and the Empire." His words were precise, his tone polished. To the casual observer, he was the model diplomat. Karath's smile widened, but his eyes betrayed something colder, sharper. "Yes," he said, motioning Edward to follow. "Let us discuss unity." The corridors of the Aurora Zenith were dimly lit, their walls adorned with intricate carvings depicting the Empire's conquests. Edward's footsteps echoed alongside Karath's as they moved toward the council chamber. The alien general spoke of the Empire's history, its achievements, and its benevolence toward weaker species. Edward listened with a practiced expression of interest, though his mind worked relentlessly, analyzing every detail. The council chamber itself was a vast, circular room with a high domed ceiling. Rows of alien officials sat at an elevated dais, their eyes fixed on Edward as he entered. The atmosphere was oppressive, the weight of 1,000 judgments bearing down on him. Edward stood at the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "Esteemed members of the Galactic Council," he began, his voice steady and confident, "I bring greetings from Earth and an earnest desire for continued peace and cooperation." Karath took his seat at the head of the dais, his gaze never leaving Edward. "A noble sentiment," he said, the mockery in his tone barely veiled. "But one wonders, does humanity truly understand the weight of cooperation? The sacrifices required?" Edward allowed himself a brief pause, a flicker of tension playing at the corners of his mouth. "Humanity has learned much from its history, General," he said evenly. "We understand sacrifice. We also understand the value of resilience." The murmurs that rippled through the chamber were sharp, almost hostile. Edward's words hung in the air, a challenge disguised as diplomacy. Karath leaned forward, resting his massive hands on the table before him. "Resilience," he repeated, the word rolling off his tongue with an edge of scorn. "An admirable trait for prey." The room fell silent. Edward's expression did not change, but his fingers tightened imperceptibly behind his back. "Resilience," he said, his voice like steel, "is not exclusive to prey. Sometimes it belongs to the predator." The chamber erupted into a cacophony of voices, but Edward remained unmoving, a calm figure in the storm. Karath raised a hand, silencing the room with a single gesture. "We have heard your words, Ambassador," he said, his voice carrying a chilling finality. "Now, let us see your actions." Before Edward could respond, the guards surrounding the chamber stepped forward, their weapons raised. Edward tensed, his mind racing. This was no mere diplomatic disagreement. "Arrest him," Karath commanded. The guards closed in, their movements precise and mechanical. Edward offered no resistance as his wrists were shackled in cold, metallic restraints. His expression remained calm, though his piercing gaze met Caratha's with a silent challenge. "Is this how the Empire fosters peace?" Edward asked, his voice laced with quiet defiance. Carath chuckled, a deep, menacing sound. "Peace, Ambassador, is forged in fire. Perhaps your kind should have stayed in the shadows where they belong." Edward said nothing as the guards led him away. His steps were steady, his head held high, even as the council chamber doors closed behind him with a resounding thud. In the dimly lit cell where he was confined, Edward sat on the cold, metallic bench, his eyes scanning every detail of his surroundings. The walls were smooth, featureless, designed to suppress any hope of escape. A single guard stood outside the cell, his back turned to Edward. Edward leaned back, his hands still cuffed, and closed his eyes. For a moment, he appeared almost serene, but beneath that calm exterior, a storm raged. His thoughts moved with the precision of a predator stalking its prey. Carath had underestimated him, as had the entire council. They saw only the diplomat, the man bound by Earth's protocols and rules. They had no idea who they had truly captured or what he was capable of. Edward opened his eyes, his lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. The guard outside his cell shifted uneasily, as if sensing something amiss. In the quiet of the cell, Edward's voice broke the silence, a low murmur barely above a whisper. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." The words were not a threat, but a promise. The guard, a young alien soldier with mottled green skin and two bright eyes, seemed restless. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his gaze darting to the monitor on the far wall. The weapon slung across his back glinted faintly under the dim overhead light. Edward noted every movement, every detail. "Human," the guard muttered, his voice tinged with disdain. "Do you truly believe your kind stands a chance against the Empire?" He didn't turn to face Edward, but the sneer in his tone was unmistakable. Edward's lips curved into a faint smile, though his eyes remained cold. "Belief is irrelevant," he said, his voice calm, unhurried. "Action is what matters." The guard scoffed, shaking his head. "You're nothing but a frail diplomat. I don't understand why the general even bothers with the charade. Your kind." The words were cut off as Edward moved, so quickly and fluidly that the guard didn't register the shift until it was too late. In a blur, Edward had twisted his restrained hands under his legs and brought them to the front. With a sharp motion, he surged forward, yanking the guard against the bars of the cell with a sickening thud. The alien's weapon clattered to the floor as Edward's cuffed hands found the soft, vulnerable ridge at the base of his neck. "You talk too much," Edward whispered, his voice devoid of emotion. With a swift, practiced motion, he wrenched the guard's head at an unnatural angle, the crack of vertebrae echoing in the confined space. The guard's body slumped to the floor. Edward crouched, his movements precise, and retrieved a small keycard from the guard's belt. The cuffs fell away with a satisfying click, and for the first time in hours, Edward flexed his hands freely. His fingers, long and strong, moved with the dexterity of a surgeon as he retrieved the fallen weapon and checked its charge. Fully loaded. Perfect. The corridor outside the cell was empty, the air thick with the sterile scent of recycled oxygen. Edward moved like a shadow, his steps silent, his breathing controlled. Every turn, every junction was a calculated risk, but he thrived in this chaos. The ship's layout was alien, but Edward's sharp mind had memorized enough during his walk to the council chamber. He found a console in a recessed alcove and accessed its interface. The alien language scrolled across the screen, incomprehensible to most humans. But Edward's eyes flicked over it with unnerving familiarity. His time as a diplomat had included learning to decipher the Galactic Empire's primary dialects. Within moments, he had accessed the security schematics. The flagship's brig was heavily fortified, but the rest of the ship wasn't designed with an internal threat in mind. Edward's fingers danced across the controls, disabling key cameras and triggering false alarms in distant sectors. The chaos would buy him time. A pair of footsteps approached from the adjacent corridor. Edward pressed himself into the shadows, his weapon raised. Two guards appeared, their conversation muffled as they passed his position. Edward moved swiftly, striking with brutal efficiency. He dispatched the first guard with a shot to the head before the second could react. Blood splattered across the polished floor as the second alien fell, his throat slit by a blade Edward had taken from the first. The bodies were dragged into a storage closet, their absence unlikely to be noticed amid the growing confusion. Edward stripped one of the uniforms, donning it to blend in. It wasn't a perfect disguise. The fit was slightly off, the color of his hands and face unmistakably human, but it would suffice. As he moved deeper into the ship, Edward's thoughts drifted to his past. He remembered the alleys of London, the fog-drenched nights, the way his victims had looked at him in their final moments. He had always been methodical, always efficient. His actions had been painted as monstrous, but to him, they had been necessary. Survival demanded sacrifice, and Edward had always survived. Now, he was hunting again. The Galactic Empire had made a grave error in underestimating him. They saw only the veneer of civility, the carefully constructed facade. They didn't understand the predator lurking beneath. He reached the control room, its entrance guarded by two heavily armed soldiers. Edward assessed the situation with clinical precision. The room's layout, the positions of the guards, the timing of their movements. It all fell into place in his mind like pieces of a puzzle. He stepped forward, his disguise drawing only a cursory glance from the guards. As he neared, he slipped the blade from his belt, concealing it along his arm. "Routine check," he said in the Empire's tongue, his pronunciation flawless. The guards hesitated, their suspicion brief, but enough. Edward struck, the blade finding its mark in one guard's throat as his other hand brought the stolen weapon to bear on the second. The corridor filled with the stench of ozone as the plasma shot hit the guard square in the chest. Inside the control room, Edward quickly dispatched the lone technician, leaving no witnesses. The ship's controls spread out before him, a maze of alien technology. Edward's hands moved with purpose, locking down critical systems and rerouting power to cover his tracks. He planted a series of malware programs, gifts from Earth's Cyber Warfare Division, that would render the ship's advanced AI useless. Edward leaned back for a moment, surveying his handiwork. The ship was now a ticking time bomb, its systems compromised, its crew in disarray. But he wasn't done. Not yet. A soft groan caught his attention. The technician wasn't dead, just barely clinging to life. Edward crouched beside him, his expression unreadable. "Where is General Karath?" Edward asked, his tone almost conversational. The alien's eyes fluttered open, fear etched into every line of his face. He tried to speak, but the words came out as a rasp. Edward leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Tell me, and I'll make it quick." The alien nodded weakly, his trembling hand pointing to a map on the console. Edward followed the gesture, noting Karath's location in the council chamber. True to his word, he ended the technician's life swiftly, the blade finding its mark with precision. Rising to his feet, Edward adjusted his stolen uniform and collected his weapons. The council chamber was his next target. The Galactic Empire had provoked humanity, and Edward Sterling, once Jack the Ripper, was going to show them the cost of their arrogance. As he stepped into the corridor, the ship's alarm blared, signaling the chaos spreading through its halls. Edward allowed himself a fleeting smile. The hunt had just begun. The alarms howled to the corridors of the Aurora Zenith, their sharp, rhythmic blare resonating in every corner of the massive flagship. Edward moved with cold efficiency, his stolen uniform allowing him to slip past the panicked crew. The chaos he had unleashed was spreading like wildfire, disrupting the ship's carefully maintained order. Fires raged in isolated sections where he had sabotaged key systems, and the flagship's automated defenses were overwhelmed with conflicting signals. Edward's face remained a mask of calm control, though his eyes betrayed the predator within. He was not merely escaping. He was dismantling the Empire's pride, one calculated blow at a time. Every step brought him closer to the council chamber, where General Karaf no doubt still believed himself untouchable. The corridors twisted and turned, each corner revealing a new layer of the Empire's grandeur. The walls were adorned with banners depicting the Empire's insignia, a snarling beast flanked by stylized stars. To Edward, it was a hollow display, a facade meant to intimidate. He noted the irony as he stepped over the bodies of guards who had tried and failed to stop him. The Empire's might meant nothing against a man who had mastered the art of killing. Ahead, a group of alien soldiers rallied near a control junction, their weapons drawn, their voices sharp and urgent. Edward paused in the shadows, observing their movements. They were alert but uncoordinated, their fear palpable. These were not hardened warriors, but bureaucratic enforcers, unprepared for the predators stalking their ranks. Edward allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had spent years hiding the monster within, masking it with diplomacy and carefully constructed lies. But now, that monster had purpose. Humanity's survival demanded it. These aliens had provoked him, underestimated him, and now they would learn the cost of their arrogance. He moved swiftly, a blur of motion as he closed the distance. The first soldier fell before he could react, Edward's blade slicing cleanly through his throat. The second turned, eyes wide, but a single plasma shot ended his life before he could fire. The third soldier, younger than the rest, hesitated, his weapon trembling in his hands. Edward stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "Run," he said, his tone devoid of malice but heavy with authority. The soldier dropped his weapon and fled, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Edward watched him go, then turned his attention to the control junction. The terminal blinked with status reports, warnings of system failures, and breach containment zones. He scanned the data quickly, noting the ship's weakening structural integrity. His sabotage was working, but it was only the beginning. With practiced precision, Edward triggered another series of commands, overriding safety protocols and redirecting power from the ship's reactor. The flagship's core, a marvel of alien engineering, would soon become its undoing. He stepped back, satisfied, and continued toward the council chamber. The path grew more chaotic as he neared his destination. Smoke filled the air, mingling with the acrid scent of burnt circuitry. Alien crew members scrambled to contain the damage, their voices rising in panic. Edward moved among them like a ghost, his stolen uniform and calm demeanor rendering him invisible in the frenzy. When he reached the council chamber, the massive doors loomed before him, their surface etched with intricate patterns. 2 guards stood at attention, their weapons ready. Edward didn't hesitate. He approached with the confidence of a man who belonged, his steps measured and deliberate. "Status report," one of the guards barked, his gaze narrowing as Edward drew closer. Edward didn't respond. Instead, he raised his weapon and fired, the plasma shot piercing the first guard's chest. The second guard reacted, but Edward was faster, his blade finding its mark before the alien could raise his weapon. The bodies hit the floor with a dull thud as Edward stepped over them and pushed the chamber doors open. Inside, the council chamber was a scene of controlled chaos. General Karras stood at the head of the dais, his massive frame towering over the other council members. His crimson skin seemed to glow under the chamber's dim lights, his horns casting jagged shadows on the walls. The council members whispered among themselves, their fear evident. Karras turned as Edward entered, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition. "You," he growled, his voice a low rumble that silenced the room. "I underestimated you, human." Edward stepped forward, his weapon held loosely at his side. His gaze was fixed on Karras, cold and unyielding. "You did," he said simply. "A mistake you won't live to repeat." Karras descended the dais, his movements deliberate, predatory. "Do you truly believe you can stand against the might of the Empire?" he asked, his tone dripping with disdain. "You're alone, outnumbered, outmatched." Edward tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing at his lips. "I've been outnumbered before," he said. It never mattered. The tension in the room was palpable as the two faced off, predator against predator. Karaf lunged first, his massive claws swiping through the air with lethal precision. Edward moved with practiced ease, sidestepping the attack and driving his blade into the alien's side. Karaf roared, the sound reverberating through the chamber, but Edward didn't relent. He was faster, sharper, each strike calculated to weaken his opponent. The fight was brutal and unrelenting, a clash of strength and strategy. Edward's movements were a symphony of precision, each action a testament to years of honing his craft. Karaf, for all his size and power, began to falter, his attacks growing sluggish as Edward's strikes found their mark. Finally, Edward disarmed the alien, his blade pressed against Karaf's throat. The general glared at him, defiance burning in his eyes. "You think this changes anything?" Karaf spat. "The Empire will crush your kind." Edward leaned in close, his voice a whisper. "The Empire made one fatal mistake," he said. "They thought humanity was weak." With a swift motion, he ended Karaf's life. The general's body slumped to the floor, and the chamber fell silent. Edward turned to the remaining council members, their expressions a mix of fear and disbelief. "You wanted to see what humanity is capable of," Edward said, his voice cold and steady. "Now you know." He didn't wait for a response. The flagship's reactor was nearing critical failure, and his time was running out. Edward left the chamber, his steps unhurried, even as the alarms grew louder and the ship shuddered around him. The Galactic Empire's nightmare was only beginning, and Edward Sterling, Jack the Ripper reborn, was far from finished. The Aurora Zenith groaned under the weight of its own failing systems. Fires burned unchecked in its corridors, and the once pristine halls were now filled with smoke and the acrid stench of destruction. Edward moved with purpose, unflinching as the flagship shuddered violently, its structural integrity beginning to fail. Every step he took was deliberate, each action a means to one inevitable end. The stolen alien fighter he'd identified earlier was close now, just beyond the last junction leading to the hangar. He could hear the muffled chaos of scrambling soldiers and frantic commands over the flagship's intercom. The Empire was panicking, their prideful veneer cracking under the strain. Edward allowed himself a faint smile. He thrived in their chaos. As he turned the final corner, two alien guards stood blocking the entrance to the hangar. Their weapons were raised, their postures tense, but their fear betrayed them. They had seen the carnage Edward left behind, and it showed in their wide, unblinking eyes. He approached them without hesitation, his stolen uniform tattered but still serving its purpose. "Evacuation orders," Edward said in the Empire's tongue, his voice calm but authoritative. He held up the weapon he had taken earlier, the barrel tilted downward to appear non-threatening. One of the guards hesitated, his gaze flicking to his companion. The other stepped forward, his weapon still trained on Edward. "Identify yourself," the guard demanded, though his voice wavered. Edward sighed softly, shaking his head as though disappointed. In one fluid motion, he raised his weapon and fired, the first guard dropping before he could react. The second shouted in alarm, but Edward was already moving, closing the distance with terrifying speed. His blade flashed and the guard fell, clutching his throat as he crumpled to the ground. Edward didn't spare them another glance. He stepped into the hangar, the sound of his boots echoing against the cavernous walls. The alien fighter he had targeted stood ready, its sleek design a testament to the Empire's advanced technology. He climbed into the cockpit with practiced ease, his fingers moving over the unfamiliar controls with surprising confidence. The engine roared to life, the fighter humming with latent power. Edward's eyes scanned the displays, quickly adapting to the alien interface. The hangar doors began to close, an automatic response triggered by the alarms. He pushed the throttle forward, the fighter lurching ahead as it shot through the narrowing gap, narrowly avoiding the heavy blast doors as they sealed behind him. Edward adjusted the fighter's trajectory, his focus shifting to the small fleet of Empire ships that now surrounded the flagship. They had formed a defensive perimeter, their weapons trained on any potential escapees. Edward knew they wouldn't hesitate to fire, especially on an unverified vessel. His hands moved deftly over the controls, activating the fighter's transponder. The screen flickered as it transmitted the stolen codes he had downloaded earlier from the control room. For a moment, there was no response. The tension thick in the cockpit. Then the targeting systems of the surrounding ships disengaged, the codes granting him temporary clearance. He allowed himself a grim smile. As the fighter slipped through the fleet's perimeter, Edward's eyes returned to the Aurora Zenith. The flagship was now a husk of its former self, its once imposing silhouette marred by fires and explosions rippling across its surface. He adjusted the display to monitor the ship's reactor, its core dangerously close to critical failure. The sabotage had been precise, ensuring there would be no chance for recovery. The comm system crackled to life, and Edward's expression darkened as a familiar voice filled the cockpit. Human, an alien officer barked, his tone sharp with fury. You will not escape the Empire's judgment. Surrender now, and we may grant you mercy. Edward didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the flagship as its hull began to fracture. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost conversational. Your mercy means nothing to me. Your arrogance blinded you to the predator standing in your midst. Now, you'll pay the price. The officer's reply was drowned out by an alert from the fighter's sensors. A squadron of interceptors had broken formation and was closing in on his position. Edward tightened his grip on the controls, his body tensing as the first shot streaked past his ship. The fighter's agility was remarkable, its controls responding to his every command with precision. Edward weaved through the incoming fire, his movements a blend of instinct and cold calculation. The interceptors pressed their attack, their weapons lighting up the void, but Edward was relentless. He spun the fighter into a tight roll, diving toward a larger Empire cruiser before pulling up at the last second. The maneuver forced two of the pursuing interceptors into the cruiser's shields, their ships disintegrating on impact. Edward took advantage of the opening, targeting another interceptor with a well-timed plasma burst. The alien ship exploded in a brilliant flash, debris scattering into the void. Edward's heartbeat remained steady, his mind focused. Years of suppressed instincts, honed in the dark streets of London, had prepared him for moments like this. The predator within him thrived on the hunt, and now the Empire was his prey. The flagship's reactor finally reached critical failure, a massive explosion tearing through its core. The blast sent shockwaves rippling through space, the surrounding Empire ships struggling to maintain their positions. Edward shielded his eyes as the Aurora Zenith was consumed in a brilliant inferno, the once mighty vessel reduced to fragments. Edward guided his fighter away from the chaos, the interceptors too scattered to resume their pursuit. His gaze lingered on the remnants of the flagship, a grim satisfaction settling over him. The Empire had thought itself untouchable, its power unchallenged. They had learned otherwise. As the fighter system stabilized, Edward activated the long-range comms. The signal crackled as he patched through to Earth's military command. A familiar voice answered, filled with equal parts relief and disbelief. Sterling, is that you? What the hell happened out there? Edward's voice was steady, his words measured. The Empire made their move, he said. They wanted a war. I gave them a taste of what's coming. The line went silent for a moment before the voice returned, this time filled with steel. We'll be ready. Come home, Sterling. Edward leaned back in the cockpit, his expression unreadable as the fighter sped toward the edge of the system. The predator within him was sated for now, but he knew this was only the beginning. The Galactic Empire had declared humanity weak, and Edward Sterling, once Jack the Ripper, had shown them the truth. War was coming, and the galaxy would never be the same.